eliminated some of his sources because they're so obscure, and I've shortened it. But one of the reasons I love him is that if you like comprehensive, he's your guy. Today's topic. It is common practice among many Jews, especially Orthodox Jews and increasingly conservative Jews. I would say, yes, conservative Jews. What I see in Hebrew schools, what I see teachers in our Hebrew schools, often who themselves are in their teens or early 20s, they're absolutely convinced that you have to spell God G-D. And they don't understand why I'm not with them. How can they be more pious than the rabbi? And that is always what happens whenever you have a stringency. If you have a stringency and a rabbi comes along, Orthodox or conservative or otherwise, and says, that's not a real thing, people are like, why do you have this need not to be strict? Like, I feel weird that I'm stricter than you are. And you're like, because what you're keeping is not real, but that's not human nature. Human nature is, so here we go. All I can do is give you the truth. So the main idea of writing out God's name, not writing out God's name because it could be desecrated, there are several Torah sources. The most famous is, of course, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, which is generally understood by you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. This becomes a very important, it's a different topic in Jewish law, but it intersects with today's topic, which is a lot of this is wrapped up with oathing. And a lot of it really is, because my big thing in Jewish law is don't assume that the people, just because they lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, were fundamentally different than today. Basically, fundamentally, they're talking about if I hold out something and Robert puts his hand on it and swears, is that binding? Like, what makes something binding about swearing? Well, if you're swearing on a holy Bible, yes, it is binding because you just swore with using the name of God. So the sanctity of the name of God in oaths is a big part of Jewish law, just as it's kind of a big deal for us today. I mean, when it means either in a contract where you have the name of God and you are swearing in the contract that by the name of God, I promise to pay Liz 50,000 shekels for her goat. Or else I'll do something better for her house. That may not be worthy of a contract. It may take me 10 years to pay it off, but for that house, 50,000 shekels, I swear by God, this is a real contract. So you don't have to. A contract could still be binding depending on the social circumstances you live in. But if you swear by God, it's a really big deal in Jewish law. And if you could write it out or just swear orally. And that's why for most of Jewish law, the rabbis tell you, please, please, please don't use God's name when using contracts or oaths, because if you break it, it is a really big deal. And this is in contradiction to the Torah. The Torah seems to encourage vowing. It'll come up a lot as we head into the book of Numbers, and vows are a major part of Torah time spirituality. In fact, it's one of the major things. I mean, remember, they don't have a prayer book and things like that. So vowing is a big part of what takes place in temple Judaism. And it distinguishes it from rabbinic Judaism because they say, God forbid you should use God's name, take an oath you don't keep, then you are really in big, big trouble with God and big, big trouble in law. So oathing is a big deal. The Torah also forbids cursing God, which is punishable by death. The Rosh, who is one of the major legal decisors of our tradition, so there's sort of a Mount Rushmore of the legal codes. Rambam's on there, the Shulchan Aruch is on there, Yosef Karam and Isserlis, the Rosh is on there, and the Torah is on there. So he's one of the biggies that we follow. He recommended that someone who cursed God in Arabic be punished by severe physical punishment. And that becomes a very important source for whether it matters, whether God's name is in Hebrew or if it's in Arabic. And finally, Rob said a person who hears the pronunciation of God's name from his fellow must excommunicate him. This is referring to in Hebrew. So if someone pronounces Yud-He Vav-He and attempts to pronounce Yud-He Vav-He in Hebrew, they are to be, and they are not the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, they should be excommunicated. For every place where the unnecessary mention of the divine name is found, their poverty is found, is from Rambam in Maimonides' legal code, another one of the greats. Well, let's get into it. By the way, one more thing about the way the Torah is understood, which Lincoln doesn't go into. In addition to vain oaths where you took God's name, there's the cursing God, which he's mentioning. And then there's a third, which is what is the violation? Why do we have to have a geniza? Why do we bury in a cemetery manuscripts or books that have Yud He Vav He written out in Hebrew? And that goes back to the idea of not taking the name of the Lord in vain, not cursing God. And the Talmud really spells it out. It is specifically on paper, and it involves that paper getting punctured or burned. So that's why you put in a geniza, to prevent the Yud He Vav He name from either being punctured or burned. Okay, so here we go. What's this business of forbidding erasing God's names? In source Deuteronomy chapter 12, tear down their altars and cut down the images of their gods, and you shall obliterate their name from their site. So when you come upon their altar sites, you tear them down, including the name of their god, let's say Asherah, and you shall not do so to Yud He Vav He, your god. So you should never take apart an altar that is for Yud He Vav He, or an amulet that has Yud He Vav He on it, and just throw it out, or disassemble it because maybe it's an amulet that it's broken. You would not do that, you would bury it. From the Tanaitic Midrash Sifrei Devarim, Rabbi Yishmael says, from whence do we derive that a person who erases one letter from God's name transgresses a Torah prohibition? It's from here. You shall obliterate their name from that site, but not do so for Yud He Vav He. In this Midrash, Rabbi Yishmael learns from the juxtaposition of verses 3 and 4 that it is forbidden to erase even one letter from the name of God. So this is rabbinic law. That is the basis of the geniza, of not obliterating anything with God's name on it. These passages do not define what the name of God is. This definition is found in a Baraita. That's an early Tanaitic, that's an early Talmud teaching, found in Masachet Shvot. There are names of God which are erased, and there are names which are not to be erased. What are the names which are not erased? Names such as El, Elohecha, Shaddai, Adonai Tzvaot, or El Shaddai, Adonai Tzvaot. These are not erased. So there's a list of 7 names of God that are to be respected that go beyond Yud He Vav He. So they expanded the Yud He Vav He list to other names of God, and there's a list of 7. Maimonides, so these are the Mount Rushmore of legal codes, and the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch all agree. They codified the list of 7. And the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, writes, it's forbidden to erase even one letter from the 7 names that are not to be erased. And he lists the 7 names. Finally, there are some when bringing up this topic, and this will become up big later. They bring up Masachet Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud on a different issue. It says in Megillat Tanait, which is a list of days when it's forbidden to fast. On the 3rd of Tishrei, the mention of God's name was eliminated from legal contracts. For the Greek kingdom made a decree not to mention the Jewish God's name in their mouths. So let's go back to Hanukkah. The Sadducees say, no, Judaism, Israelite religion is illegal, right? You can't do it in the temple, and you can't use God's name in oaths. Does that make sense? That's part of the elimination of Judaism by the Hellenized Syrians called the Sadducees. So those Sadducees made a decree that we can't use God's name anymore because it's illegal. So when the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees defeated them, they made a decree that you should mention God's name, even in legal contracts. So remember what I said earlier about the legal contracts? Maybe you shouldn't, like if I'm just buying Liz's house and we have a mortgage, maybe I shouldn't use God's name because like I don't really need to. But then Liz knows if I'm swearing by God's name in the contract, I got extra weight on me. So the Hasmoneans said, the Sadducees said we couldn't use God's name, so we are now required. Let's always use God's name in our contracts. And so that's what they used to write. They used to write in their contracts, or standard contract in the year such and such of Yochanan, the high priest of El Elyon, God the Most High, right? That's used in the book of the War of the 4 Kings, or the 5 Kings, or the 9 Kings in Genesis. And we still preserve it in the Amidah Friday night, El Elyon, one of the 7 names. They would actually write it on a piece of paper. They made it a rule. And when the sages heard this is later, the Hasmoneans are a little pre-sage, or Perhaps it's more complex than that. They said, wait a second, we do not like this Hasmonean decree. We know it was done for a good reason, but think about it. When the debt is paid, the contract will be thrown in the dunghill. So Liz is like, I got my money back after 10 years. I cannot pass all of these files onto my kids when I pass away because they'll already be angry that the attic is full of stuff. And so I will go through my files and shred these things and throw them away. But then you're throwing away some with the name of God on it. So the rabbi said, don't listen to the Hasmoneans. Please stop using the name of God in your contracts. But that quote about the dunghill becomes the thing that people bring up in the 20th century about not writing out G-O-D. Okay, so we know that you only write out Yod He Vav He in copies of the Tanakh and in a Siddur like this. We don't write it out in something like a Haggadah or something that we think will be disposable at some point. So this is why Jews write the letter Yod He in many other, or the Yud Yud, which is common today, and many other abbreviations on texts where that they're concerned that might not be properly cared for in a Geniza. When I make photocopies for a lesson like this, I should not use God's name. And when I do by accident, they end up in our Geniza shelf out there. Okay, that's everything we got from the Torah and the Talmud. So now we get to the period of the legal codes. Most of the poskim who have dealt with our topic ruled that God's name in other languages is not holy and may be erased. So here we go to the medieval codes. The Rambam wrote, based on what we saw, Rambam wrote many of his writings. So he's the author of the Mishnah Torah, one of the two main legal codes of all time. But he wrote his works in Judeo-Arabic. And when he wrote about God, did he spell out Allah? Yes, he did not say al-ah. He wrote Allah in full. Though in a few manuscripts, we find various forms of abbreviation due to the sanctity of God's name, even in other languages. So in the copies we have of Rambam, he does not do ALL-AA or AL-AA or whatever it would be, H in Arabic, but there are a few fragments they found that do, but he did not. But in the many writings written by him, including secular letters, he wrote Allah in full. So let's go to someone else, another major decisor of the Rashbats. He was asked whether a teacher can write verses on a slate on the blackboard for children who do not own a copy of the Torah and erase the verses at the end of the week to make room for the next week. He wrote a 14-column responsum on it. And you think I talk a long time. If the verses are written in Aramaic and the names of God are translated into Aramaic, they can be erased. For there's no prohibition to erase except for the 7 names of God, which are explicitly stated in Masachet Shavuot. And if it was forbidden to erase Aramaic names of God, there would be more than 7 listed. And an Aramaic translation of God's names is not more holy than any other kinuyim, sort of substitute nicknames, such as Gadol, Gibor, Nora, Hagadol, Hagibor, Hanora, El Elyon, Adir, and so on. So they're saying that, come on, otherwise you have all these other Hebrew words that are not holy names. And if you write anything in Aramaic or another language, it can be erased. And then Rambam actually in the code, in the Mishnah Torah, he made this formal halakha as well. He agrees. The names of God in other languages are considered kinuyim regarding oaths. So if Liz and I make a contract, I can't put down Yod He Vav He, but I could say one of the other names. I could say God. I could say, I swear to G-O-D that I will pay you back in 10 years. It has some force, but that piece of paper can be thrown in the dunghill. Rabbi Shabbatai ben Meir HaKohen, the Shach, also an important decisor, said the name of God, and you can see, you can follow the centuries here. The name of God in Hebrew is the name, but in a secular language, it is not the name at all. For it's permissible to erase a name, which is written in a secular language. You can erase Gott in German and Bog in Polish and in Russian and the like. Rabbi Yair Chaim Bakarak in Germany, late 1600s, one may dispose of books in Ketav Galachut, that is Latin letters, or in Teich. So if you have something that has the word Gott in it, you can throw it out. Well, I would not imagine that anyone in the world would think that it contains holiness. We're already in the 1600s. Now we're in the 1700s. Rabbi Akiva Eiger wrote, actually in the 1800s, and if the names of God are written in other languages, they are considered just like kinuim. They're just substitutes. Rabbi Shlomo Eiger, his son in Poland, said, and if God's name was written in a secular language, such as Gott in German, he is allowed to erase it. And just like in the Shach we saw. Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen wrote in the famous code of law, the Mishnah Brura, one may not say the name of God in a bathroom or unclean place, even in another language such as Gott in German or Boga in Polish and Russian and the like. For even though this name has no sanctity in the letters of its writing and is permissible to erase or throw out, even so, it's a disgrace to mention it in the bathroom. So we hang our talit when we head to the bathroom here, and you don't bring your talit in. It's from a separate part of Judaism, which is when you're in the bathroom on the toilet, don't talk about God and Torah. So like, wait till you come out. And so if someone in the stall says, Liz, I've always had a question about this part of the Tanakh, and I know you wrote a commentary on it. Liz says, hold your horses. I'll meet you outside the door. Okay. Rabbi Chaim Ozer Godzinski says he was Lithuanian before the Shoah. So this is probably where this kind of started. And this is one of my arguments. A lot of what we consider to be real traditional. I am more stringent, I'm more holy. Often it starts in the 1900s and sometimes the 1800s. And here we finally get it. The most important respondent in Lithuania, he was asked in 1930 about the fact that the German Jewish newspaper Der Israelit, published by Orthodox Jews from 1860 to 1938, that they wrote out the word Gott in German without any abbreviation. And he wrote, if it's difficult for the newspaper to change its custom, it would be good to announce in the newspaper that people should not treat it with disrespect because of the verses and the Divrei Torah. Because remember, just like the Detroit Jewish News, you get a Devar Torah in there. Should someone really take the Detroit Jewish News and Rav Nadav spent so long writing that 300-word Devar Torah? Should they really throw that in the trash afterward? So he's like, you know what? It's really not a good idea. And if they do so, the custom will remain as it has been going now regarding the name in German. So he's saying, I don't like it. I don't like this thing, but he's not saying it's just about the name. He's also saying about the contents they're in, that it's like the bathroom. They're talking about Torah in there, but that wasn't the rule. The rule about the bathroom we already have is clear. It is actually written out that it has nothing to do with the writing of the name. That's actually in the law, just lest you should be confused. But apparently he gets confused. And Rabbi Marcus, so what happened was the guy who founded and published the magazine, the newspaper, he got really angry that Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grodzinski had publicly said, it's disrespectful that they write out the name of God and they don't tell people that they should publish on the front every day, don't dispose of this except carefully. No, really, he got really angry and he was very famous. So he wrote and responded that Rabbi Grodzinski was being overly pious. This is what I preached before. He was guilty of yohara. So yohara is the halachic category that you are stringent because you want to show that you're better than everybody else. And often you don't need to be that way. Either you are stringent, sometimes ridiculously, or you're violating the custom of the place. So if it's the custom of the place to do one thing, you have to do it different to show that you're more strict. So he's like, that is a classic case of yohara. Since I've been writing Gott in the newspaper, because the Shach and Rabbi Bakra stated above, and it is clear in Jewish law, it never occurred to him or to most other Jews that one must treat God's name in other languages as holy. So he's basically saying you don't know your halakha, and please don't criticize me and say I should have a disclaimer on my newspaper. I know more than you. This shows at the beginning of this responsum, by 1930, there was pressure to force Jews to write Gott. It locates it historically. We now know it's in the early 1900s. That people were like, Larry, did you really have to write out G-O-D in that letter you wrote to me? Did you really have to do that? Because now I got to put come on, man, like a little respect. We know it's from the early 1900s. Rabbi Louis Jacobs, one of the leading rabbis in England, founder of Masorti, wrote an anonymous response for many years in the London Jewish Chronicle entitled Ask the Rabbi. He published some under his name as Ask the Rabbi. And in Portland, he rules that according to the Shach, there is no need for the current absurdity of writing God or Alti for Almighty. To do so is to be guilty of super piety discouraged by the rabbis. Again, classic, he is saying here that classic case of Yohara, that you don't have a basis in halakha, but you want to show other people you're better than them. And that's not allowed. That Yohara is not good. Rabbi Cass Abelson, chair of the CJLS, published in 1995 that it's permissible to write God and similar names in English in full because of the Shach. He primarily quoted the Shach, which is part of the other sources I gave you. And that takes us to the final page. Yes, there's a small number of Geniza fragments that contain abbreviated versions of the word Allah in Judeo-Arabic. And thus the authors or copyists of those manuscripts consider the word Allah in Arabic to be holy. And they consider it in the same way that they abbreviated God's name in Hebrew. So in other words, it was not the practice to, it was the practice to write out Allah in Arabic for God in Jewish texts. But some people, a very small number, did put in some kind of abbreviation because maybe they were nervous about doing it. So we have can it be found prior to the 1900s? It can be found. It can be found in a very, very minority position that's not even halachic. We just see it sometimes on these fragments, sometimes, not on most of them. But that is considered a source by those who want to write out G-D. Rabbi Yeshaya ben Eliyahu Detrani the Younger wrote halachic rulings that were published actually much later, but some of the teachings were known. It should be asked about the books of the Gentiles, which they write today in their languages, and they are holy writings. So what if they publish the Christian Bible? And it includes our Old Testament or our Hebrew Bible within it, if they require Geniza. And if one should worry about God's name in them, not to swear falsely by them and not to erase them, for one who erases the name of God transgresses, and it appears to me to be strict about this. So what he's saying this is that, what if someone holds up a Bible in English and asks you to swear, but it's all in English? There's no Yod He Vav He. Should you be strict about the fact that your oath is binding? Yes, that makes sense to me. Does it make sense to you? I mean, you know. And then he's saying also that if you swear on the Bible, you should keep the oath that you made. But then also this, and this happens to me all the time. I've got English translations from JPS in the Tanakh, and I'm accumulating them. I could build another sanctuary from them because all of it's available on Sefaria and online. So how many of us still use the bilingual. We love our JPSs that have the Hebrew and the English, but do you really need just the JPS English only translation of the Torah when most of us have an Eitz Chaim on our shelf? And if we're ever somewhere else, we just look it up online. So I accumulate piles of them. They don't have the word Yod He Vav He in them in Hebrew. They just have the word God and Yod He Vav He in English characters, which is not the name of God. That's English characters. And Rabbi Isaiah ben Eliyahu said, you know what? Put them in the Geniza. And I do. I didn't even know this ruling. But come on, like if Ed had given me, Nadav, I got 3 copies from our bar mitzvah, the English translation. I don't need it. I mean, I have the Hebrew, I have the Hebrew and the English. Then I'm not going to throw it out. I'm going to put in the Geniza. And I'm with him. So that's the second opinion. One is we've got a couple of fragments historically. Second, he said, you got the English, treat it with respect. And the Rambam ruled that if a Jew takes an oath using one of God's substitute nicknames, such as Chanun or Rahun, or in another language, it's considered valid. So could I do that thing where, I don't know, Ed makes me promise I'm going to bring him my extra bicycle because his bicycle's out. He wants to borrow. Nadav promised to me. And I say, I promise to God, or I promise to the compassionate one. And then I don't have to keep it because little did Ed know that promising to the compassionate one, that's just a substitute nickname for God. And so I don't really have to keep it. And Rambam says, no, anyone who hears that you're making an oath and you use even a substitute nickname, that oath is still valid, which of course makes perfect sense, right? For reasons that go beyond desecrating God's name. So that's it. Rabbi Yonatan Eibschutz from the 1700s commented, blah, blah, blah. And due to our many sins, most of them, okay, so this is the real source-ish for where we see the custom that becomes important in the 20th century. He wrote, Due to our many sins, most of the masses are not careful, and they say in German or in Yiddish, God should punish him, God should strike him down. And they transgress a negative commandment of the Torah, and they write in all their correspondence, adieu, right? And in French, they don't even realize that adieu does not mean goodbye. It has the name of God in it, because adieu means with God. And then they throw it in the trash. So he's angry that people are signing their letters, adieu. And now, due to our many sins, they learn from the actions of the Gentiles, and the matter is returned to its disgrace in the extreme. And this requires cleverness and diligence on the rebuke of the sage of the generation follows from the masses. So I wouldn't say he's a major decisor. He's disagreeing with all of the Mount Rushmore. He's disagreeing with the entire history of Judaism, but he says it's such a disgrace, adieu. The problem is that he wanted to transfer the sanctity of the oral name of God in a foreign language, the written name of God, but his only proof text is the passage from Rosh Hashanah about throwing stuff in the dunghill, which proves the opposite of his contention. His only justification is the Rosh Hashanah text, but that said specifically, you can throw something with the word G-O-D or G-O-T-T or Allah into the garbage, as long as it's not written out in Hebrew. That's actually what it says. And then he's saying it doesn't say that. It means it all. So there we go. It has to do with the contract. So we're at the end. The Talmud and the major medieval codes, Rambam, Torah, Shulchan Aruch, rule that one must be very careful about writing and erasing one of God's 7 names in Hebrew. And as a result, all the major decisors and beyond all rule that God's names written in other languages are not sacred. They do not need to be abbreviated, they can be erased, and they do not require Geniza. This is clearly normative halakha regarding the issue for all of Jewish history. On the other hand, of the 4 major poskim who ruled on the issue, the first gives no reason of a strict ruling. The other 3 rely on Rosh Hashanah 18b about not throwing God's name in the dunghill. But since that passage explicitly refers to one of God's names in Hebrew, it does not prove their point at all, it proves the opposite. So in conclusion, we must be very careful about writing and erasing the 7 names of God in Hebrew, because these restrictions do not apply to writing God's names in other languages. And I very much oppose having it done in our Hebrew school because it encourages Yohara. It encourages the idea that you make up something that not only is not in halakha, but contradicts it to show that you are more respectful of Jewish law than someone else, rather than, I think the most respectful thing you can do is actually follow Jewish law and not contradict it to show that you're adding that you have the right to add stringencies that are otherwise not added. So that is G-D. Go ahead, Martha. That I would add at this time and to end with is, so Nadab, but why not? Fine, all of halakha says that using Gott in Yiddish or German or Allah and God in English, what would be the harm of telling the Hebrew school kids to write out G-D? Because after all, like, you're teaching them a great thing. I leave that to you to speculate. I mean, I have my own answers. I think for me, it comes back to the point of halakha is to live halachically. It's that simple, right? If someone said to me, well, you said that I can do yoga on Shabbat, but yoga, it's kind of like physical exertion and you're not supposed to work. And I say, well, all the sources say that that's not the case. And it has kind of roots in Hinduism, and that sounds like idolatry. Well, I think the sources are, unless you're doing the Hindu part of it, if you're just doing the kind of like breathe, namaste, that's not idolatry, right? But Rabbi, really, why? Because the point of halakha is to live halakha, not to live what you make up to add to it, because that is adding to the commandments. That is forbidden, and that's idolatry. In your zeal to teach our children respect and the shame of the awful generation we live in, and to go extra, are you living halachically or not? And to speculate it, often for people who are not living halachic lives at all, to be like, I may not be living a halachic life, but unlike the rabbi, I don't eat a soybean on Pesach. Or I don't write, I saw Rabbi Kane wrote this thing and it has the word G-O-D. I mean, I'm not rabbi. I don't even live halachically. My gosh, I do whatever I want on Shabbos. But I think it's disrespectful to write out G-O-D. Well, I do G-D. I think when we forget the halachas about living halachically, we stray. And I think the rabbis are right. We end up in Yohara. We end up making an image of our view of what things should be, probably hides a little bit of ego in it, masquerading as piety. Shabbat shalom. Thanks for joining me. It was really nice of you to do it. Thanks.